This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be among the soil scientists, and particularly Tony, who was very generous with his time in teaching us about his work as a scientist. Many years ago, one of my former students interviewed Tony, and that interview was edited into something that we call an oral history profile, and it was included in that 2010 book that Tony mentioned. And I'll be quoting you in a few minutes.
Ooh, scary.
So I am, as some of you may be, fairly agitated right now, and angry and worried, not just about what happened in the election, but about deeper issues and questions that have to do with the state of our society. How divided we are, how well or how poorly we understand each other, how well or how poorly we listen to each other. It's not irrelevant for me to say that at the beginning of this session, because the theme or topic or idea of civic science is very much centered on relationships between scientists and non-scientists that include a lot of listening and a lot of understanding and a lot of dealing with difference. So this is a topic that I have been working on for a number of years. I've got, as most of us do, way too many balls in the air, and so things proceed more slowly than they should, but we had an NSF workshop on this theme, as Tony mentioned, in 2014. We're working on both an essay and a book project related to this theme of civic science. The theme resonates across a lot of my work, so it's something that isn't just contained there. I feel rather strangely double-mic'd here, so I feel like I'm on an interrogation stage or something. And then I see this one person sitting there in Geneva, like the judge sitting in front of the court. So civic science is a term, like a lot of terms we hear about, that first of all, it has a history of as a specific term. Part of its genealogy is that it was first, actually maybe first, probably not first, but maybe first used in 1996 in a talk that Neil Lane gave when he was the director of NSF. And he was speaking to a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and talking about the role of science and scientists in society. And he used the term civic science to talk about basically the idea that scientists should be communicating to the public more frequently. They should be taking more time to be helping the public understand science. They should be taking more time to share the results of science, to be bringing scientific knowledge and ideas to the public in all kinds of variety of ways, not just panels in Washington, D.C., not just media interviews, but in community settings as well. That is not what I mean by civic science. The definition that he gave is not it. Civic science is also not citizen science. The way I'm talking about it, it's not applied research. It's not activist science. There's all kinds of terms out there. It's none of those. So I want to share a bit about how I have been coming to find and discover this idea of civic science in my work, and how I've been trying to make sense of it, and some of the questions I have about it. I'm sorry to be relying on notes a lot here, but I want to be careful. And as I mentioned, I'm fairly agitated right now and suffering from lack of sleep. My wife is a state legislator. She was just reelected to her 7th term in the New York State Assembly, so I was up all night the other night, and apologies for my own trouble. So civic science is not a dreamy theoretical thing that some egghead professor like me in development sociology made up and is trying to sell to people. It's not that. It's a discovery. It's a way of naming a discovery out of my own research, out of other people's research. I'm primarily a historian, but I come to the work of history with a lot of tools from a variety of disciplines: science and technology studies, development sociology, narrative inquiry and analysis, civic studies, political theory, public philosophy. I draw from all of those in my historical work. Civic science is something that is deeply rooted in land-grant colleges of agriculture, including this one very much so. But it is not contained to those colleges as a historical trajectory. Just one of the things that has happened recently in the literatures that I pay attention to, a historian from Harvard named Andrew Jewett has published a book recently that I wrote a review for a journal. It's called Science, Democracy, and the American University, From the Civil War to the Cold War. What he does in this book is he traces what he refers to as a history of scientific democrats, that's his term, from the Civil War to the Cold War. And what he's tracing is something that is not, there's not a lot of awareness of in a whole variety of places, and there's a lot of critique of and pushback against. What he's tracing is this history of thinking and work about how how science, the methods and processes of science, have huge, deep cultural and political significance and possibilities. And so there were a lot of people thinking, these are mostly people in fields like political theory and philosophy and psychology and those kinds of fields. A lot of people were deeply convinced that if we could spread scientific, people like John Dewey variously referred to as the scientific spirit or the scientific morale. Liberty Hyde Bailey wrote about this, which I'll come back to. If we could spread that, if people could learn to see the world using some of the methods and processes of science, that this would have huge transformational implications for our culture, and ones that are aligned with what we usually refer to as democracy. And most of you in this room, I'm assuming, are scientists. We can think about this. You do experiments. You make them visible and public, what you did, what you found, and it's up for debate. Other people can try it and see if they find the same thing or something different. There's real deep democratic possibilities in that kind of thing. It comes out of the whole notion of who gets to create knowledge. Well, based on the work of science, anybody who can learn these methods and processes can take part in that. It doesn't come just from the church or a dogma or the government or the king. These are big historical things I'm talking about here. Anyway, there's this long tradition of that. Civic science is connected to that, as I'll talk about a little more clearly in a minute. At the center of civic science as an idea, the way I'm understanding it is that it represents a particular way of answering a set of normative questions about the roles, responsibilities, purposes, and work of scientists and scientific institutions like universities in the civic sphere or in civic or public life. It's about the questions about the nature of the relationship between scientists and non-scientists, particularly in societies that strive to be or want to be democratic. So civic science represents a way of answering these questions. So it's important to note, normative questions are not empirical questions. They're not about what is or what has been or what could be. They use this troubling word. In the academy, we have a lot of problems with this word. The word is should. Civic science represents a way of answering a set of questions by taking the word should and answering it, not just in theory or ideas, but in practice, in the world. So the prevailing way of answering this bundle of questions about the role and relationship between science and non-scientists and science in the public sphere, the prevailing way of understanding that is that it's basically an expert-client relationship. Scientists, scientific institutions produce stuff which is communicated out to the world. And they produce stuff from a place of detachment from that world. And why is this? This is, to use the fancy academic words, there's an epistemological reason for this. Because one of the most fundamental questions we could take up in any society is, how do we produce knowledge that people can trust? Trustworthy knowledge. How do we do that? Where do we do that? Who does that? So there's a whole way, a kind of prevailing sense of, well, you need a detached thing that's outside the biased and messy world of the marketplace and the government, and you can't trust stuff that comes out of there because it's going to be self-interested and biased. So you need some place that's apart from that, where people can pursue work from an objective, disinterested, unbiased, these kinds of words people use, perspective. So that's the sort of the typical way that we look at this set of normative questions. So about what we should do, what our relationship should be, our meaning scientists. So civic science, as I've been learning in my research and work and have been coming to understand, doesn't dismiss, it's not about dismissing questions of trustworthiness. And of course, in a land-grant institution, we're not just interested in trustworthiness, we're interested in knowledge people can trust and use. The use piece is pretty important. So the civic science tradition that I'm uncovering and trying to understand doesn't dismiss all that. It doesn't say that we should never have people working from a place of detachment in laboratories, on campuses up on hills like Cornell here, the classic ivory tower. It doesn't say that we shouldn't have that. What I'm finding in my own work, and this is definitely influenced by my own perspective, which I need to be transparent about. The fancy word for that is reflexive. To be reflexive is to be conscious of your own biases and political views and to be candid about those. And I definitely have them, and that'll come out in a minute. So the tradition that I'm uncovering doesn't reject all of that. What it does, and the best way to understand it, is it expands and broadens the ground and the set of possibilities for how to be a scientist. It means that scientists don't always have to be detached in laboratories up on hills. That sometimes you can be there and you can be out and telling people in this room this, of course, this is nothing new. This is what people have done in this college for over 100 years. But not everybody thinks about that or understands that. What's important about civic science, I think, which moves us to the place of deep, deep, deep complexity, way beyond what I'm going to be able to do here with you, both because of time and other issues. What's important about it is that it doesn't just expand these possibilities of how to do work. It also opens up very distinctive kinds of promises of meaning and significance of the work. And in doing that, it opens up very distinctive kinds of challenges and problems. So what I want to do today, hopefully in enough time for us to have some interaction, because I could go on for way too long in my agitated state. I want to begin with a couple of historical artifacts from our own college here at Cornell. Brief historical artifacts. Then I want to very briefly and very superficially start taking up the task of interpreting those artifacts. This is the research that I do as a scholar. So I'm working with original material and data, and as a historian, I don't just paste and copy that data. I have to position it in a narrative, position it in an essay that interprets the meaning and significance of these artifacts. I have to put them in context. And I have to use tools to be able to do that. So I want to very briefly sort of show you sort of the inside. It's like walking into my lab in some ways. It's like the inside nuts and bolts of how we work with this material. Thinking of these artifacts like you would think of plant material or soil samples. Then I want to turn to the issue of actual practice of civic science in contemporary times. This is where I'm going to quote you. I'm going to quote somebody else more than I'm going to quote you. I'll save you. And then I want to conclude by just naming some of the challenges and questions that arise for me in thinking about this theme. And before I plunge into this, I'll say that I am approaching and doing this work in many ways out of a sense of urgent necessity, because I think institutions like this are in trouble. And I think our communities and our society is in trouble. And beyond the trouble, I think there are enormous, incredible possibilities that are untapped, positive possibilities, that civic science, I think, has a big role to play in opening up, both in dealing with troubles, but also in opening up possibilities. So here are the artifacts. These are two things I've found in my historical research. The little data points, little moments in time. So the first one actually is from 1922. The former director of Cornell Cooperative Extension, a man named Maurice Chase Burritt, M.C. Burritt, grew up on a farm in western New York, graduate of Cornell. It's called The County Agent and the Farm Bureau, a real barn burner kind of title, right? We all want to read. This was 1922, so it was pretty shortly after the Farm Bureau was created, and we know the first one was in New York in Broome County. And shortly after 1914, less than 10 years after when the National Extension System was created, and this county agent thing was a big deal. This guy went on, I don't know if anybody knows who he was, but he had all kinds of roles in New York agriculture and state and United States policy. So at the end of this book, he actually didn't write this here, so I'll have to go to it. He says at the last two pages, he said, summarizing then, the ideals expressed in this volume for the Farm Bureau movement may be put in the form of this brief creed. And then he lays out what he calls a Farm Bureau creed. So here are 4 sentences from that creed. We believe in self-help for ourselves, our community, our country, in our own abilities well developed and properly supported to solve our own problems, and in local and voluntary leadership. And here are the next 3 sentences. We believe in a program, a definite, carefully considered plan of work, local in conception and in character, which looks toward the solution of the problems which are vital to the welfare of the farm and the home. This plan of action for the organization should be made at home by those most concerned, but with the best expert advice and assistance. And then the last sentence, we believe in a partnership between farmers and the public agricultural agencies, between practice and science, for the working out of this program. So these are sentences about self-help. There's a fierce voice of independence, of you damn well better respect us, because we're going to solve our own problems, but we want to be in some kind of relationship. Best assistance, best expert advice and assistance. They're talking about a partnership. So here's the next little artifact. In 1949, the history of Cornell Cooperative Extension was published. It was written by Ruby Green Smith, who spent 3 decades as the Home Bureau leader in the state of New York. And she gave it the very wonderful title, The People's Colleges. And this is just one little, this is like a 600-page book which Cornell University Press has just republished in the past few years. I wrote the preface for the new edition. It's easily available, very interesting history. So here's a passage, here's a little passage from that as another artifact. I'm just pulling this out of one of these, it's on page 544 of this book, all right? Here it is. Extension workers need to have faith in spiritual values and to recognize the human relationships that contribute to what the ancient Greeks called the good life. They should believe that in the kinds of homes, farms, and industries which are the goals of extension service, man cannot live by bread alone. That it is not enough for people to have food, shelter, and clothing, that they aspire also to find appreciation, respect for individuality and human dignity, affection, ideals, and opportunities. These are the satisfactions that belong to democratic living. So, as a historian, I came into my work being fascinated with these land-grant colleges because I was deeply interested in the question of what is the relationship between higher education, these colleges and universities, and the public and communities, and which quickly goes to the place of what are we supposed to be doing? What are these institutions do? What's our work? And as I've been doing this research now for 20 years, I've been finding these really interesting voices that you hear in these two passages from Cornell. They're not speaking about the kind of thing we would expect to be hearing about, certainly not spiritual issues about the extension agent or the extension service. What is going on in these passages? So moving now to the next thing I said I was going to talk about, how do we interpret the meaning and significance of those two artifacts that I just showed you as discoveries from my work? And I have hundreds and hundreds of other discoveries like this, the sort of pattern of a way of thinking, of things being said. So, as I mentioned, this pushes us in really complex territory, because in order to interpret these kinds of passages, not only do we have to put them in their context of their time and place, not only do we have to put them in some kind of historical trajectory, we need tools. Just like you need tools to, those of you who are soil scientists, to do your analysis and work. And so we use tools in the field that I work in, basically as a historical sociologist, and that sort of place in the development sociology field. We use conceptual and theoretical tools and frameworks to make sense of these things, in addition to the historical tools. And the other part of the complexity, of course, here is that we're not just dealing with determining what happened. This is back to the empirical versus normative. We're not just determining what this person said this thing in this year. We have to work with trying to understand what were they trying to argue. What is the cultural significance, the larger social, political significance of what they were saying. We have to engage in those kinds of things. This gets us in all kinds of trouble, as you might imagine, because we then engage in all the debates about difference that people have about the answer to normative questions of what we should do, what we should not do. So, as I said, sparing you all the complex details of the fine-grained, nuanced, and jargon-laden material that I would have to open up to talk about these conceptual and theoretical frames, I want to just do something quickly to sort of, as part of the work of making sense of those artifacts, part of it includes going back in history, because we have to situate it in a historical trajectory. So I want to go back, and then I want to go to the present before I conclude with sort of questions and concerns out of this. So let me go back first. Because both of those artifacts in making sense of them, get us to the place where we're asking questions about scientists in scientific institutions. In the case of those things, we're talking about Cornell's College of Agriculture, and in those days, College of Home Economics as well. We need to be thinking about a historical trajectory of those institutions. So as I've done my historical work, one of the things I've seen moving back to the mid-19th century is the presence of two things that I think the work of civic science and the idea of civic science has brought together and continues to bring together in its contemporary practice, even though it's mostly unnamed, mostly untheorized. So the first one, of course, has to do with things that I would assume many of you are really familiar with and centered on. And to get to this, I'm going to quote Justin Smith Morrill, who, as many of you know, was the author of the Morrill Act that was passed in 1862. So I'm working on a paper about his vision and the vision of Jonathan Baldwin Turner, who was a contemporary of his, who many people think is the real father of the Land Grant Act. So here's a passage from the speech that Turner gave to, let's see, this is the 37th Congress. So this was in June of 1862. So imagine the floor of Congress, 1862, Justin Smith Morrill's on the floor, and one of the things he says is this: in American farming, the land is held until it is robbed of its virtue, skimmed of its cream, and then the owner, selling his wasted field to some skinflint neighbor, flies to fresh fields with the foul purpose to repeat the same spoliation. And thus annual exodus, which prevails over all the older states and even begins upon the first settlements of the new states before their remoter borders have lost sight of the savage, this is his language, painfully indicates that we have reached the maximum population our land will support on the present state of our agricultural economy. We bring forth new states by the litter, and when we want more like our Norman ancestors, we commit grand larceny and annex them. This progress seems wonderful, but with it appears the bitter fact that these new states in half a century, a brief time in the history of the states, become depleted and stationary. This early maturity is followed by a sudden barrenness. The phrase in these days was soil exhaustion. That was the term that they were using, right? So out of this, he paints this grim picture of basically how the land in the US is being totally destroyed by this horrendously bad farming. And then he issues what I think of as a prophecy of doom. He says, should no effort be made to arrest the deterioration and spoliation of the soil in America, while all Europe is wisely striving to teach her agriculturalists the best means of hoarding up capital in the lands on that side of the Atlantic, it is easy to see that we are doomed to be dwarfed in national importance, and not many years can pass away before our ships will be laden with grain, not on their outward, but homeward voyage. Then with cheap bread, he says, then with cheap bread no longer peculiar to America, our free institutions may be thought too dear by those of whom even empires are not worthy, the men with hearts, hands, and brains, vainly looking to our shores for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the grand political rhetoric, of course, we expect to hear. So what we begin to hear, of course, here is the argument for land grant colleges. Why do we need them? And what we also hear is what their work is, what their job is, what the consequences of their jobs, what the meaning and significance of their work is. And that is centered mostly around economics. But it also has an ecological dimension. There's a historian from Yale named Stephen Stoll. He's written a really beautiful book called The Larding of the Lean Earth. Gorgeously written history. It traces the evolution of the sustainability ethic in the 19th century. Beautiful book. So there's a presence by the time he's making this statement of some really strong ecological thinking about, and many of you know this, I'm sure, better than me, the history of soil science, the history of this kind of thinking. Yeah, sure.
So that would predate Rachel Carson by
100 years, yeah. Yes. Was not saying exactly the same thing she was saying, but so we start to see this in his rhetoric. But here's one other little thing that he says. I'll just give you a little nugget of. So what I think Morrill did is he basically he painted a picture of what was happening, which was almost all negative. Was really pretty much all negative. He then made this prophecy of the doom in which he used this really apocalyptic phrases about skeletons and starvation, mass starvation, and everything. And then he said, "But here's the way we can fix all that." And his answer, this is somewhat, for those of you, all this mythology about people like Morrill and the Land-Grant Act, people frankly, they just make stuff up about it. It sounds good. But when you go back and actually read because everybody thinks, yes, he was for education. No, he was for science. Everything he was talking about was the answer is science, not education. He talked about education, but frankly, it was about science. But he also said, like everybody who's complicated, he said contradictory things, and he said a lot of things about different stuff. And here's one little glimpse into that. So part of what he said is that government should aim not only to elevate and build up a nation that is great in its resources of wealth and power, but greatest of all in the aggregate of its intelligence and virtue. He said that efforts should be made to satisfy and elevate the manhood, and that word was in italics, of the mass of the people. Statesmen and legislators, he said, should aid to elevate the class upon whom they lean for support and upon whom they depend for their audience. He also said that every nation should be giving all men, must succeed not only in giving all men, quote, an opportunity by their own labor to obtain a substantial support, but also a higher and possibly more difficult task, which is to combine the largest freedom with the largest rewards of labor, free government and personal independence, something that Morrill argued was key to securing, quote, the immortality of our republic. So he's not just talking about economics, he's not just talking about soil depletion and ecology, he's talking about something we would have to put under the category of culture, political ideals. So part of making sense of these anecdotes is going back and understanding the ways in which the people who built these institutions, who worked at these institutions, who were political advocates for these institutions, understand what they were supposed to be about, what their work was supposed to be. And we find in Morrill science as the centerpiece of the positive thing that would have to contribute to the world, but we also find all this stuff about, in those days there was, this gets into the weeds with political theory, but republicanism was the political philosophy, the public philosophy that a lot of people worked out of, not democracy. Democracy was still emerging as an idea that was seen positively. Many of you may know that Plato rejected democracy. Thought it was a really terrible thing. It was actually asking the mob to rule. It was asking for mob rule. So he rejected that. And the founders of this country also rejected democracy. They wanted instead a representative republic. And so they were grounded in this philosophy that scholars refer to as republicanism. Civic republicanism is one of the strains of that. Morrill was in that category. And so he paid attention to what he referred to as virtue. And I will say to you that this is one of the reasons why the Morrill Act has the sentence in it that talks about liberal and practical education for the industrial classes. That word liberal signified that the education was not to be narrowly technical or practical, but liberal and practical, for reasons that had to do with the understanding that we need to be educating and helping to create citizens in these days in a republic not just technicians. And here is where my next piece in the history comes in, and then I'm going to be done with the history. And this comes from Liberty Hyde Bailey. Because there's this, it's situating these artifacts. One historical trajectory is this whole thing about the land grant institution and, the whole thing about soil exhaustion, about all the things that had to do with bad farming, and science was the key, is the key. But the other historical grand narrative that we need to situate those artifacts in is a narrative about oppression and freedom and liberty and self-rule, and the word we use a lot today, democracy. And nobody has spoken to this more eloquently and concisely that I have found in the period I'm looking at than Liberty Hyde Bailey. And he did so in many places, but the most eloquently in his book that was just republished last year for its 100th anniversary, The Holy Earth, his 1915 book. There's a passage in that book, section in the book, I think it's called The Democratic Agriculture and the Democratic Basis, or something like that. I've erased out the header of that. Here's what Bailey wrote in this passage. This again brings us something into view that is absolutely essential for interpreting the meaning and significance of a Farm Bureau Creed artifact and the Ruby Green Smith artifact. Here's what Bailey said. For years without number, for years that run into the centuries, when men have slaughtered each other on many fields, thinking that they were on the fields of honor, when many awful despotisms have ground men into the dust, the despotisms thinking themselves divine, for all these years there have been men on the land wishing to see the light, trying to make mankind hear, hoping but never realizing. They have been the pawns on the great battlefields, men taken out of the peasantries to be hurled against other men they did not know, and for no rewards except further enslavement. And this next sentence goes right to just and moral in the Land Grant Act. They may even have been developed to a high degree of manual or technical skill that they might better support governments to make conquests. Then he says, they have been on the bottom, upholding the whole superstructure and pressed into the earth by the weight of it. So here's Bailey in 1915 giving us a sweeping view of thousands of years of human history, and the farmer, the person on the bottom, the peasant, the oppression of that person used by governments, used by kings, maybe even trained technically in laboratories, in universities, in colleges. But then he says, and he's telling a story here. Bailey is doing a grand prophetic narrative piece of work here. Then he says, the 19th century brought a parting of the ways in the United States that foretold the end of this terrible story of oppression, narrative oppression. During this time, Bailey wrote, farmers and others at the bottom began to receive recognition not only for their economic value of their work, but also, and according to Bailey, most importantly, for their humanity and dignity and their agency in standing as citizens. In his view, this multidimensional recognition was what inspired the creation of the United States Department of Agriculture in 1862, land-grant colleges in 1862, agricultural experiment stations in 1887, and finally the National Cooperative Extension System in 1914. Quoting Bailey, quote, a new agency has been created in the Agricultural Extension Act, which was signed by President Wilson on the 8th of May in 1914. A new instrumentality in the world has now received the sanction of a whole people, and it almost staggers one when one even partly comprehends the tremendous consequences that in all likelihood will come of it. Then he, conceptualizing extension work in political rather than narrowly technical terms, he pointed to the problem of relating, quote, in Bailey's words, all this public work to the development of a democracy. I am not thinking so much of the development of a form of government as of a real democratic expression on the part of a people. Agriculture is our basic industry, As we organize its affairs, so to a great degree shall we secure the results in society in general. And then Bailey went on to talk about higher education, and he said higher education's engagement with farmers needed to take the form of a democratic association that is deeply educative. For him, it was imperative that, quote, education should result or function politically. This is the ex-dean of a college of agriculture, this college of agriculture. Perhaps as an ex-dean, he said these kinds of things when he was still the dean. This was 1915. Education should result or function politically. With respect to the kind of education that should be provided by land-grant colleges of agriculture, Bailey wrote, and this goes right back to Justin Morrill, this is Bailey interpreting the meaning and significance of the Land-Grant Act, of liberal and practical education, of his role as a scientist, of the role of others of his colleagues in this institution. This is what he's doing. This is how I interpret what he's doing when he wrote this. It is not sufficient to train technically in the trades and crafts and arts to the end of securing greater economic efficiency. This may be accomplished in a despotism and result in no self-action on the part of the people. Every democracy must reach far beyond what is commonly known as economic efficiency and do everything it can to enable those in the backgrounds to maintain their standing and their pride and to partake in the making of political affairs. Now, if you can't hear the Farm Bureau Creed's words resonating in that quote, if you can't hear what Ruby Green Smith said resonating in that quote, I'll go back and read them again. So we are discovering something here that's really interesting, that speaks to these normative questions of the role. None of this is anti-science, none of it. None of this is against scientists doing work in laboratories. And Bailey was a fierce defender of what we would call basic research. Fierce defender of that. He pushed back very hard against what he thought of as the totally irresponsible demand by politicians and by the public that everything scientists did at these institutions should have immediate practical usability. He pushed back very hard against that because he said every creation of knowledge is a contribution to our commonwealth. And there are other reasons why he was against that. So I've got years of work I'm doing in interpreting all this and trying to develop this idea out of this history and heritage of thinking and work going back to the 19th century. But it comes into the present, what I'm talking about. And that's what I want to, so I want to quote you for a second. But before quoting you, so I and students and I have done a lot of, I've become fascinated with all of this, not just as something to read in the archives, people who are no longer living, but wondering, wow, all of this is in the DNA of these institutions. I wonder if that's still happening today. I wonder do we have people saying similar things who are scientists like Bailey was, or administrators? How do people today talk about their work? What is the work that scientists at institutions like Cornell are doing when they're out beyond the campus? So I've been spending years doing these oral history interviews, finding engaged scientists and inviting them to tell stories about their work and experience, about their lives, how they became an engaged scientist. So I published several books of collections of these things with analysis and interpretation. One of my favorites, which is unpublished because Don won't let me publish it yet, is a weed scientist, one of your friends maybe, named Don Weiss from the University of Minnesota. Does anybody know Don Weiss?
Yeah.
You know Don Weiss? So I just want to read a couple of passages from his profile, which begins to help us move beyond just kind of the idea of civic science, but what does it look like in practice? What are the elements of practice in civic science? What do civic scientists do? What the heck am I talking about, basically? You know, beyond some philosophical thing that has grandioseness to it. So here's two passages I want to read from Don's profile. And I invite him to tell his life story. How did you end up as a weed scientist at the University of Minnesota? Where did you grow up? So he grew up as a Mennonite on a farm in Ohio. raised by Mennonite parents. But he got all the way to the place in his story where he was talking about his getting the job at the University of Minnesota. So I'll read you just a passage from that. When I arrived here at the University of Minnesota, which was in 1974, when I arrived here at the University of Minnesota, the position I got had two obligations. It was an 80-20 split, 20% teaching, so that meant I would be teaching 2 courses. My primary responsibility in teaching was to teach the undergrad weed management course. At that time, the student population was about 80 to 120 students. The other obligation, which I found very intriguing, was the 80% research. I had no extension or outreach component officially. The research component was to work on perennial weed management and grass seed production in northern Minnesota. Although I did have the opportunity to work on perennial weed management and other cropping systems statewide, my primary responsibility was to work with a group of farmers in Roseau and Lake of the Woods counties and a series of other bordering counties on perennial weed management in legume and seed production. The University of Minnesota College of Agriculture, specifically the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics, had developed a relationship with the area of the state that goes back a number of years, probably back to the late 40s and early 50s. There was a group of scientists from the St. Paul campus who were breeding grasses and legumes. It just so happened that at the time, some students from northern Minnesota were attending the St. Paul campus and had been taking some courses and learned about these breeding programs and found that one of the faculty had developed a series of varieties of bluegrass. I'm way out of my depth here talking about what he's talking about. So I'm just reading you what he said. One of them was called Park Kentucky Bluegrass. In the interaction that the faculty members had with the students from that area of the state, they decided that they would try some of these grasses in northern Minnesota. First, the climate was ideal for growth and development of Kentucky bluegrass, plus the community and these students were interested in bringing that crop to the area of the state because of its riskiness in producing annual crops. So in the late 40s, this relationship was developed, and Kentucky bluegrass seed production started in that area. My position was created as a result of trying to expand grass legume seed production to other species other than Kentucky bluegrass. Now he talks about the problem with expanding that. The reason they wanted that person to deal with that problem had to do with reducing the risks. Then he says a group of farmers had organized called the Northern Minnesota Bluegrass Producers. They developed around this initial opportunity created by the university to produce Kentucky bluegrass. They then wanted to move forward to create new opportunities. They had organized to ask the experiment station and through the experiment station, the legislature, to create this new position, his faculty position. So it was pretty well set up ahead of time that the core group that I would interact with in northern Minnesota was this loose-knit group of seed producers. When I interviewed at the University of Minnesota, I interviewed not only on this campus, I interviewed them on the campus, but I also interviewed with those farmers. And those farmers had direct input into my selection. So I didn't develop this network. I was brought in as part of this network that had developed years before my arrival. I was brought in as one who could fit into that philosophy and be willing to work in that community and help them develop these new economic opportunities. So here's a little glimpse of the historical reality. It's a little moment in time, one person's career. So as I've researched across institutions around the country, this is in the DNA of these colleges, this relationship. Here's a scientist whose whole position is grounded and defined in relationship to specific place, specific people. So what becomes important is what is Don's work? And Don is a good friend of mine. He was the director of MISA, the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, when I was doing my PhD in Minnesota. And he's a real smart-ass joker. And he has the habit of always saying, I'm just a weed scientist. But he's not just a weed scientist. He's fiercely engaged in the world and in his field and the institution. And you know, he's a philosopher, he's a civic educator, he's all kinds of stuff. So I want to read one more passage, a brief passage that begins to give us a glimpse into his practice. I'm naming this as civic science. You could name it anything you want, but I'm naming it as civic science with respect to this whole set of discoveries that I'm making and the tools I'm using to analyze it. So he's just giving us now a little glimpse into what he does. So each spring, we, not just my project, but Nancy Elke, who is one of his other colleagues, fly to northern Minnesota and spend 2 days with the farmers and other members of the community. I need to emphasize that the network of people that supports the grass seed industry are university personnel, extension within northern Minnesota, as well as bankers, processors, and community members. So it's a very broad set of players who are active in helping set the agenda and providing leadership for the research and education program. Each spring in March, we get together, we go through a 2-day discussion, which is made up of presentations, discussion, and future planning. So the research agenda that I carry out is not just my research agenda. It is a research agenda that has been developed, I would say even approved, by this network of people. It becomes my obligation to carry out that work in partnership with them, as well as to report back to them, help facilitate the conversation around results, and help them provide the leadership for taking next steps and the next series of research questions, which would then be carried out to answer questions for that community. Of course, there's a wide range of interest. In that setting, we have individuals who want to sell inputs. So they would like to see cropping systems developed that use certain specific inputs. Why? So they could make a profit selling those inputs, such as herbicides, fertilizers, etc. We have a set of processors and marketers who are interested in getting seed from the farmer to process, charging the farmer for processing, and then taking the seed and marketing it. We have the farmers who want to control the processing and want to have a greater piece of the pie of marketing. So you have a full array of interests. It basically comes down to facilitating this group of people in a way that they continue to remember why they are doing this work. This work is being done to add stability to that community to really develop sustainable systems. So the conversations that we've had over the years really come back when these issues develop to remind them of what we're trying to accomplish together. That's been part of my primary responsibility. I remind them why they created these positions. Dr. Elling's position, Nancy Elke's position, and my position in the first place. I have told them that and had that open up the conversation. It is a group that allows that to happen. I remind them that many of them are in that community because of this relationship that has developed between that community and the University of Minnesota. All of that came out when I said to Don, because I knew him, "You're just a technician. You're a weed scientist technician. All you do is you go out to the community with a clipboard and you say, what are your problems? What do you need? What do you want? And then you go back to your lab and you just cook up the answers and then you give them to them. That's all you do." I sometimes use this strategy in doing interviews, but only if I build some level of trust, because it's disrespectful if you don't do that. But I knew because I knew him, that was not all he was doing, that he is not just a technician with a clipboard. And you hear it in his response. He reminds them of, why are we here? What are we doing? He's conscious of the differences in interests. And for God's sake, this is the first time I discovered that weed scientists were civic educators. That they knew that it's ingrained in him, and this goes all the way through the history of these institutions. And by the way, none of this is perfect. It's deeply flawed. Don Weiss is not some perfection, heroic figure up on a pedestal. All of this is imperfect. It's incompletely done. It's messy and all that kind of stuff. But what we see here is a practice of civic science in which scientists, and by the way, Don has produced hundreds and hundreds of published articles in the top journals in his field and gotten hundreds of millions of dollars of funding. So it's not either you do this stuff or you do the science. It's not an either or. It doesn't mean that Don does everything. You have partners who do. That's why you have the extension facilitators in the local community. There's an ecology that's required to do this civic science work. So now I want to get into my closing here to just say, out of what I'm just in the middle of this work, so I'm sort of dumping out all this stuff that I'm discovering and trying to make sense of it in real time here. But certainly what emerges from this are a set of challenges and questions that I want to name very briefly. And the first one, of course, that a lot of people name when thinking about this tradition of work in land-grant colleges is money, right? Capacity. I've been at Cornell since 1999. People like Heidi in the back and others in this room can tell you who've been here longer than me. We have lost faculty. We have lost capacity in this institution to work with people in the state of New York. They've lost it in Minnesota. They've lost it in a lot of other states. Public disinvestment in higher education has eroded the tradition of civic science, scientific work engaged with, like Don's work. And Don tells a story about when he started his job, all the money he got from the experiment station, and it was enough, as he put it, to run a show. He could run a lab. He could open a lab up and would have gotten. And then he talks about how today you don't get that. So you got to go to industry. And that opens up a whole set of challenges. So money is an issue. It's a challenge. Public disinvestment, loss of capacity. But this isn't just about capacity. And now I'm just going to give you the tip of a very big, complex, and deeply contested, I wouldn't say controversial, but it's controversial for a lot of people in different ways. Divisive, well, I don't know. It's not just about capacity, it's about the way that scientists are trained, the political influences on science and scientific institutions. There's a woman named Stephanie Lee who is a development scholar. She's an anthropologist, done a lot of work in Southeast Asia. She wrote a book called The Will to Improve, sorry. I think it's called The Will to Improve. And she talked about two practices that are central to the realm of development work. And by the way, land grant work is development work. In the 19th century, what they were doing is they're trying to change the way farming is being done. They're trying to change the way people are eating, change the way people are raising their kids. It's development work, right? So there's two practices she has identified in her work, both of which are anti-civic science. And they're parallel, they're companion practices. One of them she refers to as rendering technical, and the other one she refers to as rendering non-political. So to summarize a very complex story, what this means is you come into a situation that is multi-dimensional. There's all kinds of stuff happening. Like, just think about the two northern counties in northern Minnesota that we got a glimpse of in Don's passage. There's all kinds of political and cultural and economic things happening. And this process of rendering technical is to strip all that out and say, this is not a problem of politics up here, this is just a problem of technical science. And surprise, when you do that, then the technician is able to provide the answer. Hey, I got the answer for that. If you leave the politics and stuff in, they don't have the answer. So when you do this, when you render something technical, when you render it non-political, you simplify it. And we all know this. You simplify it too much, you have suddenly produced a real problem. And your intervention is going to be a real problem. This is, I said this is divisive or controversial or whatever. A lot of, this is basically pointing the finger at institutions like our college. And if you do the history and stuff, you can see the ways in which the college, this big expansive thinking of Bailey and Ruby Green Smith has flattened. We don't hear this kind of stuff anymore. And there's all kinds of reasons why. It's not just about people being bad people. This is a complicated thing. And this is what we do in my field of really trying to understand it, use robust tools to be able to do that. So that's another problem. There's another reality that's really important, is that we don't have very good public cultures in these colleges, or in our fields for that matter. A lot of what we do is based on a theory of change, bets we're making. If we do these things, that this will happen. If we disseminate information, parents will raise their kids better, or eat better, or whatever. And those theories of change need to be subject to critical evaluation. How well is that working out? We don't have very good public cultures in these institutions where we create spaces to really engage around this, or to hold each other accountable for more than just the technical piece. And this takes time. This pushes against cultures in disciplines and fields. There's all kinds of reasons why this is a challenge. There's also a problem with overly ideological politics and morally righteous politics, which tends to polarize these kinds of things. Here I come right back to the election where I started. Instead of creating a space where we can hear across lines of difference and speak to it respectfully, but also critically, we have a sort of zero sum. These people are totally right and good, and these people are totally bad and evil. That is death to civic science. Because civic science is really grounded. Here's where my own bias comes in, more of democratic populist politics. So I'm going to stop here. That's a little glimpse into all this. I went too long, and I'm sorry about that. But there's a lot here.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.